Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Oklahoma. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1922. America was emerging from the shadows of the Great War, seeking normalcy in a world forever changed. In Oklahoma, the oil boom transformed sleepy towns into bustling centers of commerce and opportunity. But not every story from this era speaks of prosperity and progress. Some whisper of darker things that unfolded away from prying eyes in places where the tall grass of the prairie conceals secrets never meant to be unearthed. In Garfield County, about 17 miles northwest of Enid, stood a weathered farmhouse belonging to the Mason family. To passing travelers on the dusty skeleton road, it appeared like any other homestead dotting the landscape. A two-story white clapboard structure with peeling paint, a wraparound porch, and a red barn some 50 yards behind. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to suggest what would later be discovered. According to county records preserved in the Garfield Historical Society archives, the property had been purchased by Thomas Mason in 1917 after he'd made a modest fortune in cattle before transitioning to wheat farming. The deed of sale, signed March 12th of that year, transferred ownership from the previous resident, an elderly widow named Margaret Holloway, who had reportedly moved to Kansas City to live with her sister after her husband's death. Mason, his wife Eleanor, and his brother Raymond moved to the property that spring. What few neighbors they had described the family as reserved and particular about their privacy. The Masons kept largely to themselves, making only necessary trips into Enid for supplies, attending no church functions, participating in no community events. This wasn't entirely unusual for the region. Many farmers valued their solitude, but the degree of isolation was notable even by local standards. A local shopkeeper's ledger, later recovered during the investigation, noted that Thomas Mason's monthly purchases consistently included unusually large quantities of kerosene, even during summer months when heating needs were minimal. The ledger shows that in July of 1922, for instance, Mason purchased 7 5-gallon containers, a quantity that might be expected in December but raised eyebrows in midsummer. When questioned about this years later, the shopkeeper, Harold Jenkins, recalled thinking it strange but never feeling it was his place to inquire further. "A man's business is his own," Jenkins stated in a 1946 interview for the Enid Daily Eagle's retrospective on the case. Especially out on those farms where they might need things city folk wouldn't understand. What makes this case so disturbing isn't merely what happened, but how successfully it remained hidden for so long. The flames that eventually revealed everything had been burning, metaphorically speaking, for years before anyone noticed the smoke. The isolation of rural Oklahoma in the 1920s created perfect conditions for the events that would unfold at the Mason farm, events that might have remained forever hidden had a series of coincidences not brought them to light. The first documented incident connected to the case occurred in late September of 1922. Jeremiah Wilkins, a cattle inspector traveling through the region on behalf of the Oklahoma Livestock Association, reported to the Garfield County Sheriff's Office that he had observed unusual activity at the Mason property while passing by on the road shortly after dusk. According to his statement preserved in county archives, he witnessed what appeared to be a nighttime gathering in the field behind the barn, with multiple lanterns arranged in some manner of pattern. The official report includes Wilkins's hand-drawn sketch of the arrangement, a series of lights forming what he described as something like a wagon wheel with extra spokes, or perhaps a star with too many points. Wilkins stated that he slowed his automobile, finding the scene curious. When he observed Thomas Mason emerge from the barn and stare directly at him from across the field. Something in the man's posture, described by Wilkins as unnaturally still, prompted him to continue driving without stopping. In his statement, Wilkins noted that Mason made no gesture of greeting or acknowledgement, merely stood watching the road like a man expecting someone who isn't welcome. No action was taken on Wilkins' report. In rural Oklahoma of the 1920s, a man had every right to light lanterns on his own property without explanation. The incident might have been forgotten entirely, if not for what followed. Eleanor Mason had no close friends in the community, according to all accounts. She purchased fabric from Miller's General Store in Enid approximately once every 2 months, speaking little beyond necessary pleasantries with the shopkeeper's wife, Martha Miller. In October of 1922, Martha noted in her personal diary, recovered decades later by her granddaughter and donated to the Garfield County Historical Society, that Eleanor's appearance had changed dramatically since her previous visit in August. Mrs. Mason came for her usual purchase of cotton twilled a day, Martha wrote on October 7th. I hardly recognized her. Her face was drawn, her complexion ashen, as though she had suffered some wasting illness. Her hands trembled as she examined the fabric, and I noticed peculiar marks on her wrists, like small circular burns, which she hastily covered when she saw me looking. When I inquired after her health, she gave me such a vacant look that I thought she hadn't heard me. Then she said, "The air in the house disagrees with me." She purchased her fabric and left without another word. I mentioned it to Henry, who said Thomas Mason had seemed perfectly normal when buying supplies last week. Strange that illness should affect only the wife. Martha Miller's diary entry continues with an observation that seems minor, but would later take on significance. The oddest thing, as Mrs. Mason was leaving, I noticed that her shoes left damp prints on the floor, though it hasn't rained in weeks. When I looked closer, the liquid seemed slightly viscous, not quite like water. It had a faint metallic odor that lingered until I mopped the floor. Throughout that autumn, Thomas Mason maintained his normal routines in town. His brother Raymond, however, was not seen at all during this period. Raymond had been known in Enid as an educated man, unusual for the farming community. He frequently purchased scientific journals and books through the town's only bookshop, engaging the proprietor in discussions about advances in chemistry and biology. The bookshop owner, Frederick Simmons, later testified that Raymond had expressed particular interest in the new discoveries regarding cellular regeneration and had special ordered several medical texts from Eastern universities. When the local barber, Samuel Guthrie, inquired after Raymond's absence during Thomas's monthly haircut, Thomas reportedly replied that his brother had taken to his research with renewed vigor and barely left the farmhouse's study. The nature of this research was never specified in any recovered document, though Thomas allegedly added that Raymond believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything. Guthrie thought little of it at the time. Many men returned from the war with eccentric interests and behaviors. The first mention of fire appears in the records of Dr. James Whitaker, the only physician serving the northwestern portion of Garfield County in 1922. On November 7th, Thomas Mason arrived at his office in the late afternoon, seeking treatment for what he described as minor burns on his forearms. Dr. Whitaker's medical log, maintained meticulously throughout his 40-year practice, notes, T. Mason, male, 42, burns to both forearms, first and second degree. Patient claims injury sustained while burning brush on property. Burns appear uniform in pattern, inconsistent with typical brush burning accidents. Circular in shape, approximately 1 inch in diameter, evenly spaced along forearms. Patient refused to remove shirt despite suggestion of possible additional burns underneath. Treated with silver nitrate solution and bandaged. Patient declined offered morphine for pain, stating he needed clarity of mind. Asked if injuries were related to his wife's condition, patient became uncooperative and departed hastily. The doctor made no further notes regarding the incident, nor did he report anything to authorities. The physician-patient relationship was considered sacrosanct, and without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing to report. When interviewed in 1924 for a medical journal article on rural healthcare challenges, Dr. Whitaker reflected on the case. In hindsight, the signs were there, but what action could I have taken? A man with unusual burns isn't evidence of anything sinister, and the isolation of these farms, the distances involved, makes regular monitoring of patients nearly impossible. By the time we know something is truly wrong, it's often too late. Meanwhile, Eleanor Mason had stopped coming to town entirely. When deliveries were made to the Mason farm, infrequent occurrences, but necessary for larger items, delivery men reported being met at the edge of the property by Thomas, who would accept the goods without inviting them further onto the grounds. One delivery man, Owen Clark, later told investigators that on his November delivery of a replacement plow, he distinctly heard a woman's voice calling from an upstairs window of the farmhouse. When he looked up, he saw a curtain fall quickly back into place, but no face. When he mentioned this to Thomas, the farmer reportedly tensed before explaining that his wife had been indisposed with female troubles for some time and valued her privacy. Clark noted in his statement that Thomas's manner seemed nervous, unlike his usual self, and that there was a strange smell about him, like metal left too long in the sun. Most tellingly, Clark observed that Mason's hands were covered in what appeared to be burn marks similar to those reported by Dr. Whitaker, though now in various stages of healing, suggesting multiple incidents rather than a single accident. The isolation of the Mason property worked to the family's advantage. The nearest neighbor, William Hargrove, lived over 3 miles away and had little reason to pass by the Mason farm. Later interviews would reveal that Hargrove had noticed an unusual amount of smoke rising from the direction of the Mason property on multiple occasions throughout the autumn of 1922, but had assumed it was related to normal agricultural burning practices common after the harvest. "A man has the right to burn what he needs to on his own land," Hargrove told investigators in 1923. "It wasn't my business to question." He did recall, however, that the smoke sometimes had an unusual color to it, not the gray of wood smoke or the black of trash burning, but something with a faint bluish tint to it. He had attributed this to something odd in the soil out that way, rather than to anything suspicious. As winter approached, the activities at the Mason farm became increasingly withdrawn from public view. Thomas Mason's trips to town grew less frequent, with larger purchases made each time, suggesting he was stocking up to minimize travel. The kerosene purchases continued, now supplemented by unusual quantities of salt, according to store ledgers. In November alone, Mason purchased over 100 pounds of rock salt, an amount that might be justified for a large meat-preserving operation, but the Masons were not known to butcher beyond occasional chickens for personal consumption. The combination struck the shopkeeper as odd. Large amounts of both were typically associated with meat preservation, but the Masons had no registered slaughter permit, nor were they known to operate as butchers. When Jenkins casually inquired about the purpose, Mason reportedly stated that Raymond had found new agricultural applications for salt that would revolutionize soil treatment. No such agricultural technique was known to exist, then or now. Jenkins later recalled that Thomas had appeared feverish during this conversation, with a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the November chill, and that he had departed quickly after making his purchases, leaving behind a paper with strange diagrams that Jenkins had kept out of curiosity. This paper, which might have provided valuable insights, was unfortunately lost in a store fire in 1931. December brought the first significant snowfall of the season to Garfield County. The white blanket that covered the landscape revealed things previously hidden, among them tracks. On December 12, 1922, a postal carrier named Joseph Finch was attempting to deliver a package addressed to Raymond Mason when he noticed something peculiar. His statement to the sheriff, taken months later, described multiple trails in the snow, all leading from the house to the barn, then continuing beyond to the north field. The tracks appeared to have been made by someone dragging something heavy. What struck me as odd was that while there were multiple paths leading away from the house, I could see no returning trails. It was as if whatever was dragged out never came back. Finch delivered the package to Thomas at the door as usual, but mentioned the unusual tracks. According to Finch, Mason's demeanor changed immediately. His previously cordial greeting became strained, and his eyes took on a haunted quality. He grabbed the package, stated curtly that they had been moving equipment, and closed the door without signing the receipt. Finch might have dismissed the incident entirely, had he not. On his return journey past the property an hour later, observed Thomas Mason in the field, methodically covering the tracks with fresh snow. This struck the postal worker as peculiar enough that he mentioned it to his supervisor upon returning to the Enid post office. No formal report was filed. The incident was merely noted in the station log, where it remained unnoticed until after the events of January 1923. The Mason farm fell silent for the remainder of December. No visits to town were recorded in any merchant's ledger. No visitors reported coming to the property. The house stood still and quiet on the prairie, chimney smoke the only sign of habitation. Local hunters passing within distant view reported seeing lights in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. But this alone was not cause for concern. Then came the night of January 4th, 1923. William Hargrove, the distant neighbor, was returning late from Enid after attending to business matters. Taking the northern route home, he passed within view of the Mason property shortly after midnight. What he saw caused him to stop his vehicle entirely. The barn was illuminated from within, Hargrove later testified, not as if from lanterns, but as if it were glowing somehow with a light that didn't quite seem natural. Steady, not flickering like flame, but pulsing slightly, like a heartbeat. I could see shadows moving across the walls, large shadows, distorted by the structure. And there was a smell on the wind, like nothing I'd encountered before. Something acrid, metallic. It reminded me of the time I visited a steel mill in Kansas City, that same scorched metal scent, but with something else underneath, something organic, like meat left too long in the sun. I considered driving up to the house to ensure everything was all right, but something told me it was better not to. Some instinct. I continued home, but mentioned it to my wife at breakfast. Hargrove's wife suggested he ride over the following day to check on the Masons, advice he decided to follow. But by mid-morning on January 5th, when Hargrove set out on horseback toward the Mason farm, he could already see a column of dark smoke rising from the direction of the property. By the time he arrived, the barn was fully engulfed in flames. Thomas Mason stood in the yard, watching the structure burn. He made no efforts to extinguish the blaze. When he noticed Hargrove approaching, witnesses say he displayed no alarm or concern, merely nodding in acknowledgement. Faulty wiring, he reportedly explained, though the barn, like most agricultural structures of the time, had no electrical supply. When Hargrove pointed this out, Mason amended his statement. Oil lamp got knocked over, but his tone lacked conviction, and his gaze never left the flames. What struck Hargrove most, according to his later testimony, was Mason's appearance. His clothing was disheveled, as if he'd been wearing the same things for days. There were dark stains on his shirt. Could have been blood, could have been anything. And his eyes, they had a hollow look to them. Not the eyes of a man who'd just lost valuable property in an accident, but the eyes of someone who'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Hargrove offered to ride for help, but Mason declined. Nothing to be done now, he said. Best to let it burn out. When Hargrove inquired after Eleanor and Raymond, Mason stated simply that they were indoors, resting. The neighbor, uncomfortable with the situation but finding no clear cause for alarm, eventually departed, looking back several times to see Thomas still standing in the same position, watching the flames consume the structure. The barn fire might have remained a private matter, if not for what happened 3 days later. On January 8th, Thomas Mason himself walked into the sheriff's office in Enid and, according to the duty log, requested assistance with a matter at his farm. His appearance was noted as severely disheveled, appearing not to have slept in several days. When Sheriff Robert Caldwell and Deputy James Foster arrived at the property that afternoon, they found the farmhouse door standing open. Thomas Mason sat on the porch steps, staring out at the charred remains of the barn. "I believe my wife and brother may have come to harm," he reportedly told the officers. "I've not seen them since yesterday morning." A search of the premises commenced immediately. Eleanor and Raymond were nowhere to be found. Their personal belongings remained in their rooms, clothing in drawers, Raymond's journal open on his desk, Eleanor's hairbrush still containing strands of her dark hair. There were no signs of struggle or violence within the house. What the officers did note, however, were unusual modifications to the home. The windows in both Eleanor's and Raymond's bedrooms had been fitted with additional locks on the outside of the doors. The attic space had been converted into what appeared to be some kind of laboratory with shelves of glass bottles containing unidentifiable substances, a large desk covered in papers filled with complex chemical formulas, and a metal table with leather restraints attached to its edges. When questioned about these findings, Thomas Mason offered no explanation. Sheriff Caldwell's initial assessment, recorded in his official report, suggested that the missing family members might have wandered off, perhaps suffered an accident on the property, or possibly left voluntarily. Thomas Mason insisted neither was likely. "They wouldn't have left," he stated repeatedly. They couldn't have. The ambiguity of this statement, particularly the distinction between wouldn't and couldn't, later became a central focus of the investigation. At the time, however, it was merely noted as the distressed words of a man concerned for his family. The search expanded to include the grounds surrounding the house. Dogs were brought in from Enid to assist. They showed particular interest in the burned-out barn, but found nothing conclusive among the ashes and charred timbers. The dogs also followed a scent trail leading from the house to a small creek that bordered the northern edge of the property, where the trail was lost. One handler noted that the dogs' behavior was unusual. They followed the scent eagerly, but showed signs of distress, whining and backing away at certain points along the trail. This was attributed to possible contamination of the scent or the presence of wild animal odors. Thomas Mason accompanied the search parties, appearing cooperative, if somewhat detached. Multiple officers noted his unusual calm in their reports. "Subject displays minimal distress considering circumstances," wrote Deputy Foster. "Answers questions directly, but volunteers no additional information unless specifically asked. Maintained steady eye contact but seems to be looking through rather than at interviewer. Periodically stares at his own hands as if seeing something not visible to others." On the second day of searching, attention turned to a root cellar, located approximately 30 yards behind where the barn had stood. The heavy wooden doors were secured with a padlock. When asked for the key, Thomas Mason claimed not to have it, suggesting Raymond had likely been the last to access the storage space. Sheriff Caldwell ordered the lock broken. What they found inside changed the direction of the investigation entirely. The root cellar had been converted into what several officers described as a workshop of sorts. A wooden table dominated the center of the space, its surface stained dark. Metal implements hung on the walls, tools of unusual design that defied immediate identification. Some appeared to be modified surgical instruments, others custom-created devices with no clear purpose. Shelves lined with glass jars contained substances that would later be determined to be various oils, resins, and chemical compounds. A small kerosene stove stood in one corner, a metal pot still resting on its surface, containing a hardened residue that gave off a strong metallic odor when disturbed. Most disturbing were the notebooks found stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. Written primarily in Raymond Mason's hand, they detailed experiments of an unnerving nature. While the specifics were couched in technical language and personal shorthand that made immediate interpretation difficult, certain phrases stood out to investigators. "Subject responds well to thermal stimulus, remarkable resistance to conventional methods. E shows promising adaptation to protocol, and most disturbing, transcendence requires complete cellular reconstruction. The vessel must be emptied before it can be filled anew. When confronted with these discoveries, Thomas Mason's demeanor reportedly changed. According to Sheriff Caldwell's personal notes, not included in the official report, but later discovered among his effects after his death in 1946, Mason seemed to collapse inward, as if a string holding him upright had been cut. He requested a moment alone, which was denied. He then asked for water, and upon receiving it stated, "I tried to stop it when I realized how far it had gone. The fire was meant to end it, to purify what had been corrupted. But I fear it may already be too late." This statement was immediately recorded by Deputy Foster and became the first piece of evidence suggesting that the barn fire had been deliberately set. Thomas Mason was taken into custody on suspicion of arson, though no formal charges regarding his missing wife and brother were filed at that time. He offered no resistance, reportedly telling officers as they escorted him to their vehicle, "Perhaps it's better this way. The walls of a cell might keep it contained." The investigation intensified. Specialists from Oklahoma City were called in to examine the contents of the root cellar. Professor Edwin Harrison from the State University's Chemistry Department was among the experts who reviewed the materials. His report, filed January 17th, noted that many of the substances found were consistent with experimental petroleum derivatives, but contained organic components of unidentifiable origin. Several of the compounds, he noted, had properties that seemed contradictory to established chemical principles, though he attributed this to contamination or degradation of the samples. Meanwhile, the remains of the barn were methodically sifted, ash by ash. On January 14, 1923, investigators made a grim discovery among the debris: metal buttons consistent with those on Raymond Mason's favored waistcoat, alongside what appeared to be bone fragments. Further excavation revealed additional human remains, charred beyond visual identification. The state medical examiner, Dr. Lawrence Peterson, conducted a preliminary examination at the site. His field notes described the remains as significantly altered not only by fire, but by what appears to be pre-mortem chemical exposure. Bone structure shows unusual patterns of decay and reconstitution, as if the normal process of decomposition had been somehow reversed and then accelerated. Without laboratory analysis, I cannot state with certainty what chemical agents might have caused such effects, but they are unlike anything in my 20 years of forensic experience. When informed of this discovery during questioning, Thomas Mason reportedly showed no surprise. "It had to be done," he said, according to interrogation transcripts. "You don't understand what was happening to them, what they were becoming. Raymond thought he could control it, direct it. He was wrong. By the end, there was more of it than there was of them." The case took another turn when investigators began interviewing residents of neighboring counties. A pattern emerged of travelers reporting unusual encounters on the roads near the Mason property throughout the autumn of 1922. 3 separate accounts described picking up a woman walking alone at dusk, who matched Eleanor Mason's description, but who gave different names to each Good Samaritan. In each case, the woman requested to be driven to Enid but spoke little during the journey. All 3 drivers noted that she seemed distant or confused, and had a peculiar odor about her that one described as like a struck match. James Pedersen, a cattle buyer who had given one such ride in late October, reported that the woman had sat unnaturally still during the entire journey. Not once did she shift position or adjust her skirt or make any of the small movements you'd expect, he told investigators. And her skin, I happened to brush her hand when she was getting out of the car. It was hot to the touch, like someone with a high fever. I asked if she was ill, but she just looked at me with these empty eyes and said, "The process is nearly complete." Then she walked away. I watched her go a few blocks, then she turned down an alley and disappeared. Always wondered what became of her. Most telling was the account of Dr. Howard Phillips from Kingfisher County, who reported treating a woman in October 1922 who claimed to be Eleanor Mason. According to his medical notes, she sought treatment for persistent wounds that would not heal properly. Dr. Phillips recorded, "Patient presented with unusual lesions on both arms, circular in nature, approximately 1 inch in diameter. Wounds appeared cauterized but inflamed at edges." What was most remarkable was the tissue surrounding the wounds. It had a waxy quality and an unnatural pallor, with visible veining that appeared darker than normal, almost black in coloration. When questioned about their origin, patient became agitated and claimed they were burns from cooking accidents. Upon further examination, similar marks were observed on her back and shoulders, impossible to have been self-inflicted or accidental in the manner described. When confronted with this inconsistency, patient gathered her belongings and fled the office before treatment could be administered. Dr. Phillips had made one other notation that he shared with investigators. Patient's temperature measured 103.8 degrees, yet she displayed no other symptoms of fever, no sweating, flushing, or discomfort. When I commented on this, she replied, "The heat is necessary for the change." I intended to admit her immediately for observation, suspecting severe infection, but she refused and became highly agitated. Dr. Phillips had not reported the incident at the time, considering it merely a case of possible domestic abuse, unfortunately common and rarely prosecuted in that era. In light of the disappearances, however, he came forward with his records. When shown a photograph of Eleanor Mason, Dr. Phillips confirmed it was the same woman he had treated, though he noted that her eyes in person had a quality the photograph doesn't capture, a flatness, as if she were looking at the world through glass. While in custody, Thomas Mason's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He alternated between periods of complete silence and manic episodes during which he would recite what guards described as passages in a language none could identify. He refused most meals and was observed scratching patterns into the walls of his cell with his fingernails, geometric designs similar to those found in Raymond's notebooks. One guard reported that the scratches seemed to gleam faintly in the darkness, like phosphorescent material, though this claim was dismissed by his superiors as imagination. During formal questioning on January 18th, Mason finally provided a more detailed account of events, though one so fantastical that investigators initially dismissed it as the ravings of a guilty mind seeking to avoid responsibility through claims of insanity. According to transcripts, Mason claimed that his brother Raymond had, in the spring of 1922, made a discovery of tremendous significance while researching ancient agricultural practices. What began as an attempt to improve crop yields through historical methods had led Raymond to uncover what Thomas described as older knowledge from the time when the land spoke. The nature of this discovery was never clearly articulated in any coherent way. Thomas described his brother becoming consumed by his research, conducting experiments initially on soil samples and small animals, then gradually focusing his attention on human subjects, specifically Eleanor. "It began with small things," Thomas reportedly stated, "a drop of solution in her tea, a salve applied while she slept. Raymond said it was for her benefit, that she would be the first to transcend. I didn't understand what he meant until it was too late." According to Thomas, Eleanor began experiencing changes by late summer, alterations in her behavior, perception, and eventually her physical form. She would stand in one place for hours completely still, head tilted, as if listening to something none could hear. Her skin grew hot to the touch, so hot that water would nearly steam when she bathed. And her eyes, they reflected light differently. Not like animal eyes in the dark, something else. As if what looked out through them was seeing things we can't perceive. Raymond allegedly documented these changes meticulously in his journals, viewing them not as concerning developments, but as progress toward some unstated goal. Thomas claimed to have grown increasingly alarmed but felt unable to intervene directly against his brother, who had, in his words, always been the stronger will between us. By September, Thomas continued, Eleanor no longer spoke except to repeat phrases from Raymond's research. Her movements became economical, no wasted gesture, and the marks began appearing on her skin, those circular burns. I found Raymond applying heated metal to her arms one night. She made no sound, showed no pain. When I tried to stop him, he told me the heat was necessary to fix the changes, and that she had agreed to be the vessel. When I looked at her for confirmation, what looked back wasn't my wife anymore. Thomas described Raymond's behavior changing as well. He stopped sleeping entirely by October, would work through the night in the cellar or barn, lost weight but seemed stronger somehow. And there were moments when his face didn't seem to fit properly, as if something beneath was pressing against his skin from inside. The breaking point, according to Thomas's testimony, came in December when he discovered Raymond conducting what was described only as the final procedure on Eleanor in the barn. She was no longer herself by then, Thomas stated. What looked out through her eyes wasn't my wife anymore. And what Raymond was becoming, I can't describe it. Something was moving beneath his skin. When he spoke, there were undertones to his voice, like multiple people speaking at once. He told me it was too late to stop, that the process had gone too far, and the change had taken hold in both of them. He said soon they wouldn't need their original forms at all. Thomas claimed to have locked both his wife and brother in the barn that night, and after several days of internal struggle, set the fire on January 4th. It was the only way to be sure, he repeated throughout the interrogation. Fire cleanses completely. It's the only thing that breaks the cycle. But now I'm not certain they were still in there when it burned. The locks were broken from the inside the next morning. I searched everywhere, but couldn't find them. That's why I came to you. Either they escaped, or what's left of them did. When pressed for clarity on what he meant by what's left of them, Thomas became agitated. You still don't understand. They weren't people anymore, not entirely. They were becoming something else, something that uses people like clothes that can be worn and discarded. Raymond found it in the soil, in the deep layers, something that's been here longer than us, something that waits, and now it's awake and aware, and looking for new vessels. Officials found no evidence to support Mason's fantastical claims. Medical examiners who reviewed Raymond's notebooks interpreted them as the writings of a disturbed mind, perhaps influenced by the new spiritualist movements gaining popularity in the post-war period, or by exposure to chemical agents that affected his cognition. The technical language, they suggested, was merely a pseudo-scientific veneer applied to delusional thinking. Professor Harrison, who continued to analyze the compounds found in the root cellar, did note in a subsequent report that several of the mixtures contained organic compounds with unusual properties, possibly derived from crude oil deposits unique to this region. He speculated that exposure to these compounds might produce neurological effects, including hallucinations and paranoia, which could explain the behavior described. His report concluded that, while scientifically interesting from a petroleum chemistry perspective, there is nothing supernatural about these substances, merely unknown properties of naturally occurring compounds that warrant further study under controlled conditions. The more mundane explanation that Raymond Mason had been conducting sadistic experiments on Eleanor with Thomas's knowledge, and that Thomas had murdered them both to conceal the crime, gained acceptance as the official theory. On February 3, 1923, Thomas Mason was formally charged with the murders of Raymond and Eleanor Mason, as well as arson and desecration of human remains. He never stood trial. On February 17th, while awaiting court proceedings in the Garfield County Jail, Thomas Mason somehow obtained a sharp object, never identified, and took his own life. He left no suicide note, no final confession, no further explanation of the events at the farm. The county coroner's report noted only that deceased inflicted multiple wounds to the neck and wrists, resulting in exsanguination, and that facial expression indicated extreme terror rather than relief, unusual in suicide cases. What the report did not include, but what was later revealed in Deputy Foster's private correspondence, was that Mason had used his own blood to draw an intricate symbol on the cell wall before dying, the same pattern Jeremiah Wilkins had described seeing, formed by lanterns in the field months earlier. The case might have ended there, filed away as a tragic but closed matter if not for the subsequent incidents. Sheriff Robert Caldwell, who led the investigation, resigned his position in April 1923, citing health concerns. In his letter of resignation, preserved in county records, he wrote that the rigors of the position have taken an unexpected toll on my constitution. He moved to Missouri but was found dead in his new home just 3 months later. The cause was listed as heart failure, though no autopsy was performed. His widow later told friends that in his final weeks, Caldwell had been experiencing terrible nightmares about the Mason case and had begun keeping all lights on in their home, even while sleeping. She also mentioned that he had developed unusual marks on his arms that would not heal properly, which he had refused to show to a doctor. Deputy James Foster remained with the Sheriff's Department, but requested reassignment to administrative duties, avoiding field work. In a letter to his sister in Texas, dated September 1923 and preserved in the family's private collection, Foster wrote, "I cannot shake the feeling that something from that farm followed us back. The smell comes to me at odd moments, that scorched metal scent. Sometimes I wake convinced that someone is standing in the corner of my bedroom watching. The doctor says it's merely the mind processing a disturbing case, but I'm not convinced. Last week I found a perfect circular burn on my forearm after waking from a dream about the Mason cellar. I've told no one here, they would think me unbalanced. But I know what I saw, and I know this isn't merely psychological." Foster left the Sheriff's Department entirely in 1925 and relocated to California. Lawrence Peterson, the medical examiner who had analyzed the remains found in the barn, published a paper in a small regional medical journal in 1924 titled "Unusual Chemical Effects on Human Tissue Observed in Burn Victims." The paper described, in carefully scientific language, the strange properties he had observed in the Mason remains, hypothesizing that exposure to unknown petroleum derivatives might produce tissue alterations mimicking accelerated evolution at the cellular level. The paper received little attention at the time, but has been occasionally cited in later research on chemical preservation techniques. His subsequent correspondence makes no mention of the Mason case, suggesting either that the incident stopped or that he chose not to document them further. Perhaps most troubling were the reports from the new owners of the Mason property. The land was sold at auction in June 1923 to Jacob and Mary Thornton, who planned to establish a horse breeding operation. Within 2 months, they had abandoned the property, forfeiting their investment entirely. Though they spoke little publicly about their reasons for leaving, a statement given to their insurance company claimed persistent, unexplainable phenomena, including areas of intense heat with no visible source, and sounds of movement in rooms that were empty. Mary Thornton later confided to her sister, according to family letters discovered in 1957, that she had twice observed a woman's figure standing in the upstairs window when the house was known to be empty. More disturbingly, she claimed to have found circular burn marks appearing on the wooden floors overnight, in patterns that seemed deliberate. The final incident that prompted their departure involved their stable hand, a man named Frank Willett, who reported that he had been alone in the barn when he felt a presence behind him and turned to see something that wore a human shape but moved all wrong. Willett left the property that same day, reportedly abandoning his month's wages, rather than returning to collect them. The Garfield County Clerk's Office recorded no fewer than 7 changes of ownership of the property between 1923 and 1930, with no resident remaining longer than 6 months. Local rumor held that the land was tainted in some way. though public discussion of the Mason case gradually faded, replaced by more immediate concerns as the Depression took hold. The original farmhouse was finally demolished in 1931 after standing vacant for over a year. The demolition crew reported finding unusual patterns carved into the floorboards beneath the carpets and behind wallpaper, geometric designs similar to those described in Raymond Mason's confiscated journals. The foreman, Michael Sullivan, told the Enid Daily Eagle that several of his workers refused to continue after the discovery, claiming they had experienced burning sensations when touching the symbols. Sullivan dismissed these claims as superstition, but did note that the wood around the carvings had an unusual quality, almost like it had been petrified, though that should be impossible in such a short time frame. During the demolition, a sealed metal box was reportedly discovered within a wall cavity near the attic laboratory. According to Sullivan's account, the box contained papers covered in writing and diagrams and a glass vial of dark liquid. Before these items could be properly examined, however, they were destroyed in what Sullivan described as a small explosion and flash fire when one of the workers attempted to open the vial. The worker suffered severe burns to his hands and face, but survived. In the hospital, he allegedly told a nurse that he had seen something moving in the liquid just before it ignited, though this claim was attributed to shock and medication. The property remained unused for agricultural purposes throughout the remainder of the 1930s, eventually being purchased by the county for unpaid taxes. In 1941, as America entered World War II, the land was sold to the federal government as part of a larger acquisition of properties for military training purposes. A small temporary facility was constructed there, officially designated as a communications outpost, but rumored locally to be involved in chemical weapons research. Military records from this period remain partially classified, but documents declassified in 1967 confirmed that the site was abandoned after only 4 months of operation due to equipment malfunctions and personnel issues. A brief medical report mentions several staff members developing unusual dermatological conditions, requiring their transfer to specialized facilities. No connection to the Mason case was ever officially acknowledged, and it remains unclear whether the military was aware of the property's history when acquiring it. By the 1940s, the story of the Mason family had faded from public consciousness, becoming little more than a local legend occasionally recounted on stormy nights. The land itself was eventually absorbed into a larger agricultural holding and returned to wheat production, the exact location of the original structures lost to memory as property lines shifted. The case resurfaced briefly in 1963 when a graduate student from the University of Oklahoma, researching a thesis on rural crime in the early 20th century, discovered the case files in the state archives. Judith Reynolds spent several months reviewing the evidence and even visited the approximate location of the former Mason farm. Her academic advisor reported that Reynolds became increasingly agitated as her research progressed, convinced she was uncovering a pattern of deliberate concealment in how the case had been handled. According to her notes, recovered after her disappearance, Reynolds had identified several inconsistencies in the official reports. Most notably, she found that the number of bone fragments recovered from the barn site was insufficient to account for 2 complete adult skeletons. She also noted that certain pages appeared to have been removed from Raymond's journals before they were archived, and that Thomas Mason's full confession had been heavily redacted in the official transcript. Most intriguingly, Reynolds discovered a connection never previously documented. Margaret Holloway, the widow who had sold the property to Thomas Mason in 1917, had been Raymond Mason's academic advisor at a university in Kansas before her husband's death. This suggested that the Masons' purchase of that specific property might not have been coincidental, but deliberately chosen for some quality known to Raymond through his prior association with the Holloways. Reynolds never completed her thesis. According to university records, she withdrew from her program in November 1963, citing personal reasons. Former classmates later recalled that she had become obsessive about the Mason case, covering her apartment walls with timelines and maps. Reynolds reportedly moved to California soon after leaving the university. Attempts to locate her for interviews in subsequent years were unsuccessful. One former classmate interviewed for a 1968 newspaper article about unsolved Oklahoma mysteries claimed that Reynolds had called her shortly before her disappearance, sounding panicked and exhausted. According to this account, Reynolds said she had been visited by Eleanor Mason in her apartment, an impossibility given Eleanor's presumed death 40 years earlier. The classmate dismissed this as evidence of Reynolds's deteriorating mental state, exacerbated by overwork and isolation. The physical evidence from the case, Raymond's journals, the implements from the root cellar, and photographs of the property, were stored in the Oklahoma State Archives until 1968, when a catastrophic fire destroyed a significant portion of the collection. Official reports attributed the blaze to faulty electrical wiring. All materials related to the Mason case were lost, with one curious exception. A single metal container reportedly found at the center of the fire's origin point, completely undamaged. This container held a soil sample taken from the Mason property in 1923. The sample was transferred to the University Geology Department, where it remained in storage, unlabeled and forgotten, until a 1979 inventory brought it to light again. Professor Daniel Morrison, a geochemist who examined the sample out of curiosity, noted in his laboratory journal that it contained unusual organic compounds with properties inconsistent with typical soil composition. His preliminary analysis suggested the presence of petroleum derivatives with molecular structures I've not previously encountered. Before he could complete more thorough testing, however, Morrison was hospitalized with an acute respiratory condition that developed after several days of working with the sample. During his recovery, the sample was misplaced during a laboratory reorganization and never recovered. What remains now are only secondary sources, newspaper accounts, personal letters, diary entries, and the scattered recollections passed down by those peripherally connected to the events. The full truth of what occurred at the Mason farm in 1922 will likely never be known with certainty. Some modern analysts have suggested that Raymond Mason may have been experimenting with early petroleum derivatives readily available in Oil Boom, Oklahoma, which could explain the chemical smells, burns, and psychological effects described in witness accounts. The region's oil fields were known to produce crude with unusual properties, some of which remained unclassified and unstudied in the early days of petroleum science. Exposure to such compounds, especially through direct skin contact or inhalation, could potentially cause hallucinations, personality changes, and even physical symptoms like elevated body temperature and skin lesions. Others propose that the family may have been victims of environmental poisoning, perhaps from contaminated groundwater, leading to both physical symptoms and mental disturbances. This theory gained some support in the 1990s when a geological survey of Garfield County identified several areas with naturally occurring arsenic concentrations in deep aquifers. Long-term arsenic exposure is known to cause neurological symptoms and skin conditions that might align with some of the described effects. The psychological interpretation suggests that Raymond Mason, possibly suffering from post-war trauma or pre-existing mental illness, developed delusions that he gradually imposed on his isolated family members. Thomas, in this view, eventually recognized the danger, but responded by eliminating the perceived threat rather than seeking help, subsequently constructing an elaborate fantasy to justify his actions. The subsequent phenomena reported by others could be attributed to suggestion and the power of rumor in a rural community already primed for supernatural explanations. A handful of researchers in more esoteric fields have proposed more radical interpretations, suggesting that the Mason case represents a genuine encounter with unknown forces, whether defined as supernatural, extraterrestrial, or simply as natural phenomena beyond the scientific understanding of the time. These interpretations point to the consistency of certain details across independent accounts: the distinctive odor, the circular burns, the unusual properties of recovered materials, and the pattern of subsequent incidents affecting those who came in contact with the case. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a historian specializing in oil industry development, published a paper in 2005 titled "The Dark Harvest: Unrecognized Consequences of Early Petroleum Exploration in Oklahoma Territory." While primarily focused on documented environmental impacts, the paper includes a brief section on the Mason case as an example of how little was understood about the chemical properties of certain crude oil variants and their potential effects on human physiology and psychology. Harmon notes that several early oil field workers in the region reported experiences similar to those described in the Mason case: unexplained burns, sensory disturbances, and vivid hallucinations, though none with the apparent severity or lasting impact. What cannot be easily dismissed, however, is the consistent description of that distinctive odor, the scorched metal smell reported by multiple unconnected witnesses over decades. Nor can we ignore the pattern of those who touched the case subsequently withdrawing from normal life, relocating abruptly, or in some cases, meeting untimely ends. The last documented connection to the original case came in 1967, when a man claiming to be a distant cousin of Thomas Mason contacted the Garfield County Historical Society requesting information about the family. The Society's records show that copies of available newspaper accounts were sent to an address in New Mexico, but the correspondence ended there. The Society's secretary noted that the return address proved to be a vacant lot when they attempted further communication. In 1957, William Hargrove, by then an elderly man and one of the last living witnesses with direct connection to the case, gave an interview to the Enid Daily Eagle. His parting statement perhaps best encapsulates the lingering unease that surrounds the story. Some things we aren't meant to understand completely. I've spent 34 years trying to forget what I saw that night, the barn glowing from within, the shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't. I don't know what Thomas Mason did or didn't do to his family, but I know what I smelled on the wind that night. And sometimes, even now, when the air is just right at sunset, it comes back to me, like something opening that should stay closed. The former Mason property remains private agricultural land today. Local residents report nothing unusual about the area, though few know its history. The last documented strange occurrence came in 1969, when a field worker reportedly discovered an unusual metal object while plowing, a small box covered in intricate engravings that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. According to local gossip, the worker brought the box home but disposed of it in a creek the following day after his house mysteriously caught fire while he slept. The worker, a man named James Kettering, refused to discuss the incident publicly, but reportedly told close friends that he had dreamed of a woman with burning hands the night of the fire. No formal investigation of this incident was conducted, and Kettering left the area shortly afterward. A brief note in the local newspaper mentioned only that a small fire damaged the Kettering residence on County Road 17, cause undetermined. Kettering's whereabouts after leaving Oklahoma remain unknown. And so the story of the Mason family and their final fire recedes further into history with each passing year. Like many such tales, it provides more questions than answers, more shadows than light. Perhaps that is fitting for a case where fire, traditionally a source of illumination, served instead to obscure the truth. What we know with certainty is limited. A family lived in isolation, conducted unusual experiments, and met a tragic end. The nature of those experiments, their purpose, and their ultimate outcome remain shrouded in conjecture and fragmented evidence. The witnesses are gone now, their testimonies preserved only in yellowing papers and fading memories. The land continues its cycles of planting and harvest, indifferent to the events that may have transpired upon it. Oil still flows from the deeper layers of Oklahoma soil, fueling the modern world, just as it once fueled the ambitions of men like Raymond Mason. The knowledge he sought, whatever its nature, remains either undiscovered or, perhaps more troublingly, discovered but unrecognized for what it is. Those seeking definitive conclusions will invariably be disappointed. But in that disappointment lies the true horror of the Mason case. The suggestion that beneath the orderly surface of rural life, beneath the familiar rhythms of sowing and harvesting, beneath even our understanding of what it means to be human, there might exist possibilities both profound and terrible, possibilities that, once glimpsed, can never be unseen. In his final police interview, Thomas Mason reportedly told Sheriff Caldwell, "There are things in this world that aren't meant to be found, Robert, things that sleep in the dark places." Raymond thought he could harness it, control it, but some forces can only be contained, never controlled. And once they know you, once they've tasted you, they never forget. They never stop looking. The interview transcript notes that Caldwell asked what specifically these forces were. Mason's response, the last coherent statement recorded before his suicide, was simple and all the more disturbing for its ambiguity. The heat beneath, the fire that burns but doesn't consume, it was here before us, it will be here after, and now it knows we exist. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are some fires that can never truly be extinguished.